A lot has happened internationally, and I'm looking forward to hearing from Mark and Sarah on what these changes mean to the food and grocery sector. So, Sarah, reflecting on the previous year, what changes have you seen in the adoption of ESG?
Well, thanks, Charlotte. That's a great question to get us going. So one of the things that I've noticed is that it has become much easier to broach the conversation of ESG or sustainability amongst businesses and also within a personal sphere. So whereas before people would say, oh, yeah, okay, ESG, let's deal with that later. It's now, yep, we know it's important. We don't know exactly what it means and what it means for our business and how we need to get going and when we need to get going. But the point is people are talking about it a lot more and wanting to do something. I think the supply chain disruptions and the economic situation and with the rampant inflation, that has really focused people's minds on what they can do. And we're starting to see more actions around making efficiencies, so around cutting electricity use to reduce carbon emissions. And one thing I want to point to in terms of the evidence that this is happening on packaged goods or consumer packaged goods is from a survey that came out of the US from McKinsey, which said that those brands that made claims around ESG or sustainability over the last 5 years, they grew 28% more than brands that didn't make claims who grew at 20%. So I think those three things are really encouraging from the last year.
And Mark, is ESG here to stay and who is driving this?
That's a great question, Charlotte. I think ESG is here for the future. I think it's an important part of how businesses now do business. And I think ultimately it's consumers that are driving it. I think what we are seeing is a change in pace between different markets, which is understandable. But what we are definitely seeing, as I think Sarah's just illustrated with the McKinsey data, is that consumers really are looking for this in the majority of the developed markets around the world.
And Sarah, could you give some examples of brands who are creating value from embracing sustainability?
Yeah, sure, Charlotte. And when we're talking about value, we're not talking purely about that economic financial value. There's also many other aspects in terms of employees, looking after the environment, investor value, consumer value, etc. And some of the examples that there is a UK producer, a really large dairy producer, who has just announced that they've begun removing soya out of the feed for their dairy cows. And that's something really profound that's affecting the supply chain. And it's going to have ripple effects on that demand and what other producers are seen to be capable of doing. There's another initiative. A UK retailer has invested millions into supporting their farmers in using green fertilizer. So that is a trial going on. From a food service perspective, one of the largest global food service giants, they announced at the end of last year a green bond that would support the development of sustainability activities in the business. And then you've got a number of small producers who are cutting their carbon footprint and also putting that on the packaging and using that to gain custom, but also to make those improvements within their production. So many exciting things that are going on.
I think that's some great examples there, Sarah. And, you know, there's some of the examples of what the big businesses are doing. But I've been lucky enough to be working for one of the local coffee shops this afternoon. And, you know, things that really hit me was they were doing carbon neutral coffee on the menu. They're now doing meals that are carbon labeled so consumers can make choices based on the carbon footprint of their meals. And, you know, what that really enforced to me today was you don't have to be a big international business to drive change. All businesses can make a difference, whether they're big businesses or local businesses. And that really resonated today.
Perhaps I would add to that, and in terms of some of those brands who are creating value, you know, that there's the service brands that are around supporting the industry. So those very carbon footprinting brands that are really rolling out fast, these startups. You know, we're working with one in partnership, and they are really accelerating fast. As you said, you know, Mark, small cafes, restaurants, producers are adopting this.
A question to both of you now. You visited a number of places and had some interesting observations about the different approaches to sustainability. Can you tell us about that?
Shall I go first, Sarah? Fantastic, thank you, Charlotte. That's a fantastic question, and really lucky last year to be back out doing the international travel circuits. I think some of the things that really resonated with me last year was the Selfridges store of the future up in London, where for an iconic retailer such as Selfridges, they were doing some amazing work around how they thought consumers would see food production and shopping, years ahead. And I think that was really impressive. But I think also then, my last trip to the US, what really hit me from that trip was the importance of sustainable packing in the US market, probably further ahead than many people give it credit for, particularly across private label. And then some time in Singapore, where it's well documented that they're leading the advancements around cultivated meat through their legislation being more suited to that type of technology. Some fantastic products being produced there. But also one of my favourites, an opportunity to see large-scale rooftop farming, where they were growing salad crops and then delivering them down into the local retailers, so the Singaporeans could actually buy product that they could almost see being grown from their house. So I think the exciting thing is it's happening in so many countries now. There's not one consistent approach to how you win in ESG. The important thing is that we all need to do something in that direction.
It's really interesting, Mark, and continuing on from what you saw in the US around sustainable packaging. In France, those brands are going further, and there is a large US food service brand, quick service brand, who has now introduced reusable packaging for their dine-in. So that's because there is a French law that requires it, but they've done it in the French market, so it will be a matter of time before it rolls out. And there is another brand that supplies reusable packaging into restaurants, just independent restaurants, and you can order this alongside your meal through one of the restaurant delivery platforms. Really exciting. But being in France, it's very interesting to see in terms of these changes that on the national news, several times a week, there are topics around ESG covered. And one of the things they do every week is coverage on the major retailers, and they take you through and show what they're doing. And there's one of the national retailers is very vocal about demonstrating the changes they are making. And a recent one was the bottle return scheme, showing how that is working in those stores. So again, things are happening very fast and people are talking about it, and the population is being sensitized to it as well.
And Sarah, what specific challenges do you see in FMCG brands wanting to implement sustainability?
Well, yeah, also another really great question. Engaging people. This is a huge topic, and everybody has a role to play in it across the organization, and all of those stakeholders or people, if you like, that are working around or impacting on the organization, whether it be local authorities, governments, people, communities, consumers, etc. So it's that engagement. It really takes time, but you need people, and you need to engage with your customers to know exactly what their needs and their demands are. And all of these initiatives, that they all are possible. It does just take a long-term approach. So deeply engaging within your supply chain to do things like changing the feed that is given to your dairy cows. We talked about that earlier. That takes a long-term approach and commitment, and that's typically not something that businesses are used to dealing with. And one of the other challenges that plays into that is the sheer number of products and SKUs. Some simplification it is really needed there to have those effects at scale and quickly to meet the 2030 targets of the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals.
And Mark, digitization is continuing to change our lives of FMCG. Can you talk about how this is affecting brands and sustainability?
I think that's an incredibly exciting space at the moment. I think those of us that have worked across the food industry for a number of years have often talked about traceability being important. And I think what we're now seeing is a shift towards what I would call food transparency. And that's building on traceability as a platform and using it as a method of talking to consumers and other stakeholders or investors around the great work that people are doing across the supply chain. And to be able to make meaningful claims when it comes to an ESG policy or strategy, you need to understand your supply chain. And I think what we are seeing is businesses spending more time with those people that are producing important ingredients for them to understand what's happening across their supply chain and saying, well, our customers are asking us, how do we communicate that in a clear and concise way? And I think, you know, we're also seeing an increased focus now on greenwashing, where brands are making claims that are maybe not as robust or as auditable as they should be. And I think this advancement in digitalization is giving security of that supply chain and saying people can really stand behind robust statements. But equally importantly, it's creating that information in a way in which consumers are now choosing which brands to be loyal to, because people are following things through TikTok and Instagram and so on and so forth, which brings it all together. So I think there's a real commercial advantage where it makes sense for having a digitalized supply chain, because it gives you confidence and it gives you the ability to communicate to your target consumer. Why do ESG if you're not going to tell people that you're doing it and share the great stories that you're doing?
And Sarah, in agricultural and food brands, what should their focus be?
Well, that's such, again, a very broad topic. And one of the tracks that we've seen brands going down is really around net zero and carbon emissions, which is absolutely crucial, again, to meet the targets of the Paris Agreement of 1.5 degrees. But that isn't the only thing, that there are multiple topics regarding environment, climate and social issues. So brands need to have a look at where their impacts are in those three areas. What are they doing about the people who they work with and who work for them on their sites, in their supply chains? Are human rights being applied? Are there living wages? In terms of the environment, are they polluting? Are they managing their carbon emissions? So they've got to look at all their impacts and then analyze what is most important for them and for all the stakeholders or the people that they interact with, then put a plan together for how to address those. So agriculture and food is in just such a wonderful space, because there's a lot of things they need to do. They've got to focus on that, but they also have a chance to regenerate and repair much of the damage that has been done. So in terms of that, once they've done that materiality, it's then really simplifying the number of products, talking to suppliers, seeing what can be done within the supply chain. That would be the many other things, but that would be the focus.
And looking to the future, what do brands need to know about the ESG landscape, Sarah?
Again, continuing on from the supply chain, there are a number of legislative changes that are happening. My particular focus is in the EU. So there are reporting requirements coming out for corporates, which will cascade into their business partners and supply chains around environmental and social sustainability. So that's reporting to help people make decisions around the companies they invest in and ultimately products that are bought. And there is due diligence as well, European due diligence directive that is coming out, and that is requiring much deeper look into supply chains in terms of social standards and environmental standards. And again, coming back to Mark's comments around greenwashing, claims are under much more scrutiny. The UK Green Claims Code, the European responsible marketing and business practices, that is all coming out and putting a much closer focus on companies' activities and what they're choosing to claim.
And lastly, for those brands wanting to get started, what should they do?
Right, yeah, this is that ultimate question. So coming back to simplifying, looking at what those impacts are, deciding what's most important for the business, engaging deeply with people within the business to find out where those issues are. You can do simple things like do a waste hunt, engage with suppliers, find out what data you're going to need to track the issues that you've chosen to focus on, for example, carbon emissions. Set your baseline, set what the data you need and start reporting on it start making those improvements and be absolutely transparent, communicate honestly about what you're doing, where you've started with, your achievements, and how further you've got to go, because people want to know more and more the truth around their products.
I think there's two things that I would say as we come to the end of the interview. And I think the first one is many businesses are used to doing a value chain analysis, looking at what's putting cost into the business and how do you take it out. Continuing to drive that ethos at times can help you improve your ESG agenda, because you reduce the gauge of your cardboard, you reduce the gauge of your plastic, you make your caps on products smaller and so forth, all because you're reducing cost. But at the same time, there's some significant wins from an ESG perspective. But I think as we look ahead and appreciate this is going to be with us for the long term, it's about how businesses align commercial growth versus the ESG strategy and having both voices at the table at the same time. So as you develop new products and new brands, you're thinking about the environment as you look at your packaging solutions, as you look at your sourcing strategy, rather than develop great products and then go, gosh, now we've just launched them, we've got to go back and rework them, which isn't smart for anyone. You know, I think in an effective ESG environment, we need to start looking after tomorrow's customer today.